Michael Harrison had everything a man could want: a $500 million financial empire, a dream mansion in Manhattan, and the title of youngest CEO in America at 35. But the most precious thing in his life was little Jake, age 4, whom he took every Saturday to Central Park. That November morning, as they walked among the bare autumn trees of New York, the boy suddenly stopped in front of a bench. Sitting there, with a tissue in her hand and red eyes from crying, was a woman in her 30s weeping silently. Jake looked at his father with those pure eyes that recognize pain, and whispered the words that would change 3 lives forever. Michael didn't know that woman was Sarah Chen, a brilliant doctor who had just received the most devastating news of her life, and he couldn't imagine that his son's gesture of kindness would begin the most beautiful and heartbreaking love story New York had ever seen. Central Park, on a November morning, had that melancholic beauty typical of New York autumn. Golden leaves covered the paths like a crunching carpet, and the crisp air carried the scent of wood burning from nearby apartment fireplaces. Michael Harrison walked slowly, holding his son Jake's hand, enjoying one of the few peaceful moments of the week. At 35, Michael was considered a prodigy in the American financial world. He had inherited a small investment firm from his father at 25 and transformed it into an empire spanning from Wall Street to international markets. Harrison Holdings had become synonymous with success, but everything had a price: 70 hours a week of work, constant travel, and a private life reduced to the bone. The only exception was Jake. The 4-year-old boy with blonde curls and blue eyes was born from a relationship with Francesca, a model who, after childbirth, decided motherhood wasn't for her. Michael had obtained sole custody, and since then dedicated every free moment to his son. Saturday mornings in the park had become a sacred ritual. Michael turned off his phone, forgot about meetings, and simply became a dad. Jake ran among the trees, asked questions about everything he saw, and filled Michael's heart with that pure joy only children can give. That Saturday, Jake was particularly chatty, talking about a drawing he'd made at preschool, about a classmate who'd become his friend, about a butterfly he'd seen flying. Michael listened with a smile, realizing these were the most important conversations of his week. They were passing near the reservoir when Jake stopped abruptly. His smile disappeared and his face became serious. With that gravity children sometimes assume when they perceive something adults don't notice immediately. On a nearby bench sat a woman alone. She was about 30, with brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a camel-colored coat that had seen better days. In her hand, she clutched a tissue, and even from a distance, you could see she was crying. Not loud, dramatic tears, but that silent weeping of someone who has received news that changes everything. Jake looked at the woman, then at his father with those big eyes that seemed to understand pain much better than a 4-year-old should. He whispered that the lady was crying alone, and she was sad like when he got hurt, and Daddy wasn't there. Michael followed his son's gaze and saw the woman on the bench. His businessman's instinct suggested walking on, not getting involved in strangers' affairs. But looking at Jake's worried face, he realized this was one of those moments that define the kind of person you want to be. The woman was Sarah Chen, though Michael didn't know that yet. She was a 29-year-old doctor who worked at Mount Sinai Hospital, specializing in pediatric oncology. That morning, she had left her apartment in the village to process the news she'd received the day before from her physician. The words still echoed in her head like a sentence: pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. 30 years of life, a brilliant career dedicated to saving sick children. And now she found herself on the other side. She had no family. Her parents had died in an accident when she was 25, and no partner. She had dedicated everything to medicine, always postponing personal life. Sitting on that bench, Sarah wasn't crying from fear of death, but from the awareness of never having truly lived. She had never had her own family, never experienced true love, never taken those trips she'd dreamed of as a student. It was in that moment of absolute despair that she heard a sweet little voice beside her. Jake had approached with that spontaneity children have when they see someone in trouble, asking why she was crying and if she had gotten hurt. Michael watched his son approach the woman and felt a mix of pride and concern. Jake had an enormous heart, perhaps too sensitive for a world that was often cruel. But in that moment he realized this was exactly the kind of person he wanted to raise. Sarah looked at that angelic boy who was worried about a stranger, and for the first time in 24 hours felt something different from despair. A small light of human warmth in complete darkness. Sarah quickly dried her tears, looking at that boy who stared at her with sincere concern. In her profession, she was used to interacting with little patients, but being on the other side was completely different. Jake didn't wait for an answer. With children's simple logic, he sat next to Sarah on the bench, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Michael stepped forward, ready to apologize, but something in the woman's expression stopped him. Sarah didn't seem annoyed. In fact, she looked at Jake with that same gaze full of tenderness that Michael had seen in people's eyes when they met his son. She explained to the boy that she hadn't hurt her body, but sometimes hearts can hurt too. Jake nodded seriously, as if he understood perfectly, comparing the situation to when a classmate's mom went to the hospital and he was sad. Michael approached slowly, apologizing for his son's intrusion, explaining that Jake had a very big heart. Sarah looked up at Michael for the first time, noticing the kind eyes and worried expression of a father who deeply loves his son. She assured him she wasn't bothered at all, commenting on how rare it was to encounter such kindness. Jake pulled out from his pocket a pack of cookies that Michael had given him as a snack. He offered them to Sarah with the generosity typical of children, saying that when he was sad, Daddy told him, "Cookies help you feel better." For the first time in days, Sarah smiled. A real smile that lit up her face. She took the cookie Jake offered her, pretending it was the most delicious thing in the world, and for a moment felt less alone. Jake introduced himself with the solemnity of someone meeting for the first time, talking about his father Michael, who worked a lot, but on Saturdays belonged entirely to him. Sarah responded that she was a doctor and helped sick children. Jake's eyes lit up, comparing her to the doctor who had given him medicine for fever. When he asked if she was as good as him, Sarah felt a stab in her heart, thinking that soon she would no longer be able to help her little patients. Michael took the opportunity to gently intervene, discovering she worked at Mount Sinai in pediatric oncology. He felt immediate respect for this woman, knowing how difficult it was to work with children with cancer. Jake, always direct, asked the question that hit Sarah like a punch. If she helped sick children, who helped her when she was sick? It was exactly what she had been wondering since receiving the diagnosis. Michael saw tears return to Sarah's eyes and understood that Jake had touched the most painful point. When he tried to soften by saying that adults know how to take care of themselves, Jake replied with iron logic that when someone is sad, they shouldn't remain alone. At that moment, Michael made a decision completely out of character. No one should remain alone when they're suffering, he said, and invited Sarah to lunch with them, explaining that her company would be welcome. Sarah looked at him incredulously. This stranger was inviting her to lunch just because his son had noticed she was sad? Looking into Jake's hopeful eyes and Michael's kind eyes, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years, the warmth of belonging to something that resembled a family. After some hesitation, she accepted the invitation. As they walked toward the park exit, Sarah didn't know this lunch would be the beginning of something that would give new meaning to her final weeks of life. The restaurant Michael chose was a small family place in the heart of Soho, where they had known him for years. Sarah looked around, noticing the warm and welcoming atmosphere, so different from the cold, sterile places of the hospital where she spent her days. Seated at the table, Sarah observed the dynamic between father and son with tenderness. Michael took care of Jake naturally, cutting his meat, anticipating his needs. It was evident he had learned to be not only the father, but also the mother of that child. Jake kept his promise to demonstrate his skill with spaghetti, concentrating with comic seriousness not to get dirty. Sarah laughed at his expressions, feeling for the first time in days a sense of lightness she had forgotten existed. During lunch, Michael showed genuine interest in her work. Sarah talked about her little patients without going into painful details. Marcus, who drew superheroes for all the doctors. Sophia, who brought her favorite doll to the operating room. When Jake asked if she had children of her own, the question came like a sweet stab. Sarah had always postponed the idea of family, focusing on her career. She explained sadly that she liked them very much, but had always thought there would be time later. There was something in her voice that set off an alarm bell in Michael, a tone of finality that didn't suit a 29-year-old woman. Jake got up and went to Sarah to hug her, offering to let her borrow him if she wanted. Sarah felt different tears rising, not of despair, but of emotion for that child's purity. She hugged him tight, feeling for a moment what it meant to be important to a small human being. Leaving the restaurant, Jake took Sarah's hand naturally. Michael hesitated before saying goodbye. He didn't want to be intrusive, but didn't want this special woman to disappear from their lives. He confessed it would make him happy to see her again. Sarah looked at that gentle father and that extraordinary boy who had given her more warmth than she had felt in years. She accepted, but warned that her life was complicated and she might not always be available. Michael responded that they could face anything together. Those words resonated in Sarah's heart, like an impossible but beautiful promise. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became a constant presence in Michael and Jake's lives. Every weekend they met in the park, at children's museums, or in Michael's apartment where Sarah helped Jake with his drawings or read him stories. Michael watched how Sarah interacted with his son and saw something magical. It wasn't just kindness. It was pure, instinctive love, as if she were born to be a mother. Jake lit up when he saw her arrive, and during the week constantly asked when they would see Sarah the doctor again. But Michael also noticed other troubling details. Sarah often seemed tired beyond measure, visibly lost weight, and there were moments when he caught her staring into space. When he pointed this out, he smiled, saying it was just work stress. One Thursday evening, while they were having dinner at his apartment, Sarah had a sudden dizzy spell while helping Jake wash his hands. Michael saw her pale and stagger, managing to support her before she fell. When he asked what was happening, Sarah attributed everything to low blood sugar from skipping lunch. But Michael wasn't convinced. He had seen her eat barely a few bites at dinner, and in recent days had noticed she often moved food around her plate without really eating.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Jake, worried, ran to Sarah asking if he should call the doctor for her. Sarah knelt to his height, forcing herself to smile, explaining that sometimes even doctors feel a bit tired. That evening, after putting Jake to bed, Michael decided to address the issue. He couldn't ignore the signs that something was wrong. When he told Sarah they needed to talk, she seemed to have been waiting for that moment for weeks. She confirmed that he had noticed the changes, and Michael sat next to her, taking her hands that had become so thin. He asked her to tell him what was happening, assuring her that whatever it was, they could face it together. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw all the love and concern this man had developed for her. She knew he deserved the truth, even if that truth would destroy the bubble of happiness they had built together. The words came out simple and direct. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, 3 or 4 months of time. She had known since the day they met her in the park, having just received confirmation of the diagnosis. Michael felt the world stop. He began connecting the pieces, the crying on the bench, the deep sadness, the thoughtful silences, the growing fatigue, and the sweetness with which she had dedicated herself to Jake. as if every moment were precious because limited. When he asked why she hadn't told him before, Sarah began to cry. She explained that for the first time in months she had felt alive. Jake looked at her as if she were special, not sick. He made her feel like a normal woman who could be loved, not a terminal patient to be pitied. Michael took her in his arms, holding her tight. He confessed he loved her precisely because she was Sarah, not despite being sick. He loved her for how she smiled at Jake, for how she lit up talking about work, for how she had enriched their lives. Sarah couldn't understand how he could want to love her, knowing she was dying. Michael responded with a certainty that surprised her. He loved her even more, because now he knew how precious every moment together was. When Sarah expressed concern about Jake, about how to explain to a 4-year-old child that she was dying, Michael thought for a long time. He knew it was terrible, that it could mark his son forever. But looking at Sarah, seeing how much love she still had to give, he made a decision that came from the heart. He explained they would tell Jake that sometimes special people stay for a short time, but the love they give lasts forever, and that she had been the most beautiful gift life could give him. Sarah burst into tears of gratitude. This extraordinary man was choosing her, even knowing he would lose her. He was loving her not despite the illness, but with all the depth of someone who knows true love, knows no conditions. When she asked if he was sure about going through all this with her, Michael kissed her forehead with all possible tenderness. They were absolutely sure. They would face everything together. Him, her, and Jake. Like a real family. That night, Sarah fell asleep without fear for the first time in months. Not because the future had changed, but because she understood what it meant not to be alone, facing the unknown. In the weeks following that revelation, everyone's lives changed completely. Michael reorganized his work commitments, delegating as much as possible to spend every free moment with Sarah and Jake. For the first time in his life, he had found something more important than work, a family to love and protect. Sarah gradually reduced her hospital hours, arranging with colleagues to transfer her responsibilities. She wanted to dedicate her remaining energy not to patients for once, but to the people she had learned to love like never before. Jake, in his innocence, didn't completely understand what was happening, but sensed that Sarah was more fragile and needed special care. He became even more protective and sweet, bringing her his most beautiful drawings, sharing his favorite toys, making sure she rested when she seemed tired. Michael organized small trips outside the city, picnics in the most beautiful parks of New York State, visits to museums Sarah had always wanted to see but never found time for. Every weekend was a small adventure, every day a gift to unwrap together. One December Sunday, he took Sarah and Jake to the top of the Empire State Building. New York stretched below them, covered in light snow, and Sarah was speechless at the beauty of her city seen from that perspective. She confessed she had never gone up there in all her years in New York, never finding the time. Jake took her hand with his little mittened hands, explaining it was beautiful, and that Daddy said from up there, you could see their whole home. Michael watched them and photographed every moment with his eyes, knowing these memories would be all that remained. In the evenings, when they returned home, Sarah helped Michael put Jake to bed, reading him stories and singing lullabies with an increasingly thin but still sweet voice. Jake would fall asleep holding Sarah's hand, and she would stay there until his breathing became deep and regular. One night, while Sarah was softly singing a song she had learned as a child, Jake opened his eyes and looked at her seriously. He asked if she loved him like she was his mom, and when Sarah replied she loved him more than he could imagine, he asked if he could love her like his mom. Michael, who had heard from the half-open door, entered and sat on the other side of Jake's bed. He explained to Jake that Sarah was already his heart mom, and he was already her heart child. When Jake asked if they were a real family, Sarah and Michael looked at each other over the child's head and confirmed together. In the following days, Sarah visibly worsened. Fatigue became more intense, eating became difficult, and there were moments when pain forced her to stop. Michael accompanied her to medical visits, holding her hand while doctors talked about palliative therapies and shortening times. But even in the most difficult moments, Sarah never lost her sweetness with Jake. When her strength didn't allow her to play, she would sit on the couch and watch him build block towers, commenting on every move as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. One evening, while Michael prepared dinner and Jake slept, Sarah said something he didn't expect. She wanted to marry him. She wanted to do it immediately, before it was too late. She wanted Jake to have the memory of them as an official family, and she wanted to feel like his wife, at least for a while. Michael turned off the stove and joined her on the couch. When he tried to say she didn't need to feel obligated, Sarah interrupted, explaining it was what she wanted most in the world. She begged him to marry her, to make her the happiest woman in the world for the time she had left. Michael looked into her eyes and saw all the love, hope, and desire for normalcy that Sarah felt. It wasn't a desperate gesture, but an act of pure love. He accepted, promising he would marry her even the next day if she wanted. So, in a tiny ceremony in the hospital chapel where Sarah had worked for years, with Jake as a special witness and some dear colleagues present, Michael and Sarah got married. Sarah wore a simple ivory dress and held a small bouquet of daisies, Jake's favorite flowers. When they exchanged rings, Sarah whispered her thanks for making her feel loved. Michael responded by thanking her for teaching him what it truly meant to be a family. Jake, very elegant in his miniature suit, applauded loudly when they kissed, convinced it was the most beautiful day of his life. And indeed, for all three, it really was. The months following the wedding were the most intense and precious of Michael's life. Sarah gradually worsened, but each day was still full of small moments of joy. Jake's laughter when he tickled her to make her smile when she felt bad, the breakfast in bed Michael prepared with love, the evenings all three together on the couch watching animated movies. Michael had transformed the living room into a bedroom for Sarah, filling it with soft pillows, fresh flowers, and all the photos of their moments together. Jake had insisted on putting his most beautiful drawings on the walls, so Sarah could see them as soon as she woke up. One March morning, Sarah woke Michael with a light hand on his shoulder. It was still dark, and he immediately understood from her look that it was time to talk to Jake. In recent days, Sarah had become increasingly weak, and when she was awake, she had that gaze of someone already looking beyond this world. Michael helped her sit better, arranging the pillows. Then he went to gently wake Jake, who arrived in the living room rubbing his eyes, still in pajamas, greeting his mama Sarah as he did every morning. Sarah hugged him with what strength remained, breathing the scent of his hair, memorizing the sensation of small arms around her neck. She explained they needed to tell him something important. The boy looked at her with those big eyes, and somehow seemed to already know that what he was about to hear would change everything. Sarah reminded him that he knew about her illness, and that sometimes when people are very sick, their body gets so tired, it can no longer stay awake. Jake compared the situation to Sophia's grandfather from preschool who had gone to heaven, and Sarah confirmed she was about to make the same journey. When Jake realized he could no longer play with her, Sarah explained that every time he played, she would be watching from up there. Michael, with his voice breaking, explained they would be sad for a while, but then they would remember how beautiful it had been to have her with them. When Jake asked if she would always be his heart mom, Sarah answered firmly it would be so forever. Jake hugged her tight, and she promised that even when he could no longer see her, she would always be his heart mom, and he would always be her special boy. Sarah died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in spring, while Michael held her hand and Jake slept beside her. She passed away in her sleep with a barely visible smile, as if she were seeing something beautiful. The funeral was simple, as Sarah had requested. Jake didn't cry during the ceremony, but held Daddy's hand tight and said he could feel Mama Sarah smiling at him from the clouds. In the months that followed, Michael and Jake learned to live with the emptiness Sarah had left, but also with all the love she had given them. Jake often talked about her, telling preschool friends about his mom, who was a brave doctor and now protected all children from heaven. Michael kept his promises to Sarah. He created a foundation in her name to support families of children with cancer, donating millions annually for pediatric oncology research. But most importantly, he raised Jake, transmitting the values Sarah had embodied: kindness toward those who suffer, generosity without reserve, love that asks nothing in return. A year after Sarah's death, Michael and Jake often returned to the Central Park bench where it all began. They would sit there, and Jake would tell Daddy what he had done during the week, as if Sarah were still there listening. One of those Sundays, Jake looked at Michael and confessed he was glad Mama Sarah had been sad that day in the park. When Michael asked why, Jake explained with childish wisdom that if she hadn't been sad, they wouldn't have helped her. She wouldn't have become their mom, and he would never have known what it's like to have a mom who loves you so much. Michael hugged his son, realizing Jake had understood the most important lesson: that true love never ends, even when people go away. That evening, while putting Jake to bed, the boy said his daily prayer, greeting Mama Sarah and telling her he had helped a boy who fell in the park, hoping she was proud of him. Michael, looking at the stars over New York, was sure that somewhere Sarah was smiling, knowing her love continued to live in the heart of that extraordinary boy who had been lucky to call her mom, even if only for a short time. Because true love knows no time, and a family born from the heart never dies, even when one of its members goes to heaven. Like, if you believe true love knows no time, comment which moment of the story touched you most. Share to honor those who loved without reserve, even knowing they had to say goodbye. Subscribe for more stories of families born from the heart and love that never dies. Sometimes the most special people enter our lives when we least expect it. Sometimes the deepest love is born precisely when time is limited. And sometimes those who leave too soon leave a legacy of love that lasts forever. Because true family isn't about time, but about how much love we can give and receive.